Dead in the dirt, 50 tons of classified military steel threatened to derail a billion-dollar Pentagon contract. Elite engineers were completely baffled, panic setting in as the morning deadline loomed. Then an old, grease-stained veteran stepped up, demanded $5,000, tied a rag over his eyes, and did the impossible. The air inside Hangar 4 at the Aberdeen Proving Ground was thick with the smell of vaporized diesel, ozone, and cold sweat. It was 11:45 p.m. on a sweltering Tuesday, and the silence in the massive corrugated steel building was deafening. Sitting in the center of the floodlights was the XM-70 Juggernaut, a next-generation hybrid drive recovery tank designed to pull disabled armor out of active combat zones. It was a $140 million marvel of modern military engineering, boasting a classified turbine engine combined with a high-torque electric drivetrain, and it was currently functioning as the world's most expensive brick. Mitchell Harper, the lead project director for the private defense contractor overseeing the build, dragged a trembling hand down his face. His tailored suit was ruined, stained with sweat and hydraulic fluid. Tomorrow morning, at exactly 0800 hours, a joint congressional oversight committee was arriving to watch the XM-70 tow a fully loaded Abrams tank across a mile of rough terrain. If the Juggernaut failed to start, the Department of Defense would officially pull the plug on the project. Harper's company would face bankruptcy, and his career would be permanently over. "Try the ignition sequence again," Harper barked, his voice cracking with desperation. Up in the commander's hatch, Dr. Ian Hayes, a brilliant but thoroughly exhausted propulsion engineer, punched a series of commands into the ruggedized diagnostic tablet. "Mr. Harper, I'm telling you it's not going to work. The telemetry is completely flatlining the moment the main turbine tries to engage the primary drive shaft. It's registering a catastrophic structural obstruction." "Just do it, Ian!" Harper yelled, slamming his fist against the tank's heavily armored tread skirt. Hayes sighed, his fingers flying across the glowing screen. He engaged the starter. A deep, promising whine echoed through the hangar as the electric motors spun up, trying to force the massive turbine into motion. For 3 seconds, it sounded like the beast was waking up. Then came the noise, a horrifying metallic shriek of grinding metal, followed by a violent shudder that shook the 50-ton chassis. The onboard computers instantly severed the power, plunging the hangar back into dead, heavy silence. Colonel James Garrett, the military liaison assigned to the project, stood a few yards away with his arms crossed over his chest. "It's a hard seize, Mitchell," Garrett said quietly, though his voice carried the weight of a judge reading a sentence. "You've had your team of MIT geniuses tearing down the fuel injection timing, the electronic control units, and the hydraulic pressure sensors for 3 straight days. The computers say everything is perfect. The tank says otherwise." Harper paced like a caged animal. He walked over to a heavy steel rolling workbench, pulled out a thick leather-bound money clip, and slammed a stack of crisp $100 bills onto the grease-stained metal. He spread them out with the palm of his hand. $5,000, Harper announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He pointed a shaking finger at the dozen exhausted mechanics and software engineers slumped around the perimeter of the hangar. $5,000 in cold, untraceable cash to the man or woman who can make this engine turn over before the sun comes up. I don't care if you have to bypass the safeties, rewrite the firmware, or pray to a higher power. Get it running." The mechanics exchanged hopeless glances. Over the last 72 hours, they had tried everything. They had replaced the starter coils, flushed the pneumatic lines, and recalibrated the magnetic bearings. Every time, the diagnostic software flashed a green light, and every time, the engine choked and seized as if an invisible hand was grabbing the drive shaft. The problem wasn't in the code, but the engineers couldn't find it in the steel either. In the back of the hangar, a young enlisted mechanic named Toby Jenkins slowly raised his hand. He wiped a streak of grease from his forehead, looking nervously between Harper and the colonel. "Sir," Toby stammered, stepping out of the shadows. "The diagnostics are blind. We're relying on sensors that are telling us what should be happening, not what is happening. I know a guy." Harper narrowed his eyes. "You know a guy?" "Son, I have the top 12 propulsion engineers in the Western Hemisphere in this room. If they can't fix it, your buddy from the local Jiffy Lube isn't going to make a difference." "He's not from a quick lube spot, sir," Toby said, standing a little taller. "His name is Frank Sullivan. He's a veteran, served in Desert Storm, ran Motor Pool 6. He worked on the M88 recovery vehicles while taking mortar fire in Basra. He runs a heavy-duty diesel transmission shop out on Route 40 now. The old-timers say Frank doesn't fix engines. He listens to them. If anyone can find a mechanical bind that the computers are missing, it's him." Colonel Garrett raised an eyebrow. "Frank Sullivan? The old mechanic with the limp?" "Yes, sir," Toby confirmed. Harper scoffed bitterly. "An old grease monkey. You want to bring a washed-up relic to work on a $100 million classified hybrid turbine? Absolutely not. Security wouldn't even clear him." "Mr. Harper," Colonel Garrett interrupted, his tone suddenly icy and authoritative. "We have less than 8 hours before the brass arrives. Your MIT geniuses are out of ideas. If Private Jenkins thinks this veteran can do it, I will personally authorize his gate clearance." Garrett looked at Toby. "Go get him, Private. Fast." Frank Sullivan sat at the cluttered desk in the cramped back office of Sullivan's Heavy Repair. The clock on the wall read 12:30 a.m. A solitary, flickering fluorescent bulb illuminated a stack of final notice bills. The bank had sent the foreclosure papers 2 days ago, after 30 years of pulling transmissions out of Peterbilts and Mack trucks. Frank's arthritis and a changing economy were finally putting him under. Frank was 68 years old, with a face weathered like tanned leather and a permanent scowl etched into his features. He was missing the ring and pinky fingers on his left hand, a souvenir from a snapped winch cable during a night operation in '91. He rubbed his scarred knuckles, the phantom pain flaring up in the humid night air, and let out a long, ragged sigh. Headlights swept across the frosted glass of the garage door. A moment later, a heavy fist pounded on the side entry door. Frank slid his reading glasses down his nose and grabbed the heavy Maglite flashlight he kept under the desk. He unlocked the door to find Toby Jenkins standing in the muggy night air, breathless and out of uniform, wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans. "Frank," Toby panted, "I need your help, right now." Frank leaned against the doorframe, unamused. "Jenkins, do you know what time it is? The shop is closed, permanently by the looks of things." "It's the base," Toby explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. "They've got a prototype recovery vehicle, an XM70. The engine is seizing on ignition. The corporate engineers have been fighting it for 3 days, and they're out of time. Tomorrow, the project gets cancelled if it doesn't move. The lead contractor threw $5,000 in cash on a table for anyone who can fix it tonight." Frank stopped rubbing his hand. His eyes drifted over to the pile of foreclosure notices on his desk. $5,000. It was exactly enough to cover the arrears and keep the bank off his back for another 6 months. "Hybrid turbine?" Frank asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Yes," Toby nodded vigorously. "Geared to a high-voltage electric drive train. The computers say everything is aligned, but it grinds to a dead halt every time. Frank turned without a word. He walked to the corner of the shop, bypassed the expensive electronic diagnostic tools, and picked up a battered, oil-stained canvas tool bag that looked older than Toby. He threw it over his shoulder, wincing slightly as the weight settled on his bad knee. "Drive," Frank said. 20 minutes later, Toby's truck cleared the heavily fortified gates of Aberdeen Proving Ground, escorted by a military police jeep straight to Hangar 4. When the heavy steel doors slid open, Frank limped into the blinding halogen light. He looked entirely out of place among the sleek laptops, rolling server racks, and panicked men in ties. He wore faded denim overalls over a grey thermal shirt, a stained John Deere cap pulled low over his eyes, and heavy steel-toed boots that clicked rhythmically on the concrete. Mitchell Harper took one look at him and threw his hands up in the air. "You have got to be kidding me. This is the savior. He looks like he belongs in a museum." Frank stopped walking. He stared at Harper with cold, pale blue eyes that had seen more chaos in a single afternoon in the desert than Harper had seen in his entire life. Frank slowly dropped his heavy canvas bag onto the concrete. The metallic clatter echoed through the silent hangar, shutting up the whispering engineers. "Where's the cash?" Frank asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a rusty saw blade. Harper glared, but he pointed to the steel workbench. "Right there. 5,000. But you aren't touching a dime of it unless that monster moves out of this hangar." Frank ignored him, his eyes locking onto the XM-70. He approached the massive machine slowly, reverently. He ran his calloused, three-fingered hand along the cold steel of the external armor, feeling the subtle vibrations of the auxiliary power unit humming deep within. To the corporate engineers, the tank was a collection of algorithms, CAD drawings, and telemetry data. To Frank, it was a living, breathing beast, and the beast was sick. "Dr. Hayes," Harper snapped, "brief the mechanic." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, holding out his tablet. "Look, Mr. Sullivan, we're dealing with a multi-stage sequential failure. The primary telemetry array indicates that the fuel-air mixture is perfectly balanced, but the rotational sensors on the main drive shaft register an infinite resistance the millisecond the torque converter engages. We suspect a micro-fracture in the planetary gear assembly, but the internal cameras show nothing." Frank pushed the tablet away without looking at it. "Computers don't fix tanks, son. They just tell you how smart the guy who programmed them was. Fire it up." Harper groaned. "We've fired it up 50 times. You're just going to stress the casing." "I said, fire it up," Frank commanded, his voice suddenly booming with the undisputed authority of an old master sergeant. Colonel Garrett nodded at Hayes to comply. Hayes scrambled up into the hatch and initiated the sequence. Frank stepped dangerously close to the exposed engine bay at the rear of the tank. He didn't look at the spinning belts or the glowing LED indicators. Instead, he closed his eyes and turned his right ear toward the massive block of metal. The electric motors whined, the turbine engaged. Screech, bang, clunk! The tank violently shuddered, and the engine died instantly. "See?" Harper yelled over the settling hiss of pneumatics. "Infinite resistance. It's jammed deep inside the housing." Frank stood perfectly still. He opened his eyes, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. "It ain't infinite resistance, and it ain't the transmission," he said quietly. "It's a lie." "Excuse me," Dr. Hayes said, climbing down from the tank. "A lie? Your sensors," Frank said, turning to face the group of baffled engineers. "They're too fast for their own good. I heard a harmonic rattle right before the seize. High pitch, left side of the block, near the auxiliary hydraulic pump. The main drive shaft isn't jammed. The governor valve on the secondary air intake baffle is slamming shut because of an over-tightened tension spring. The computer senses the sudden vacuum drop, panics, and throws the brakes on the drive shaft to prevent a blowout. The engineers stared at him in stunned silence. That's impossible, Hayes stammered. The intake baffles are electronically regulated. There are no manual tension springs. Oh, really? Frank countered, pulling a greasy rag from his back pocket. Then why did I hear a carbon steel spring bind up against a titanium housing? You boys over-engineered the brain, but you let some factory line worker bolt the lungs together with standard hardware. Harper stepped forward, his face red. If you're so sure, then fix it. Prove it. I intend to, Frank said. He reached up and took off his John Deere cap. Then, to the absolute bewilderment of everyone in the room, Frank unfolded the greasy red shop rag he had pulled from his pocket and tied it tightly over his eyes, knotting it behind his head. "What the hell are you doing?" Harper demanded, stepping back. "Are you insane?" Frank knelt beside his canvas tool bag, his hands moving entirely by muscle memory, as he felt for a specific, long-handled wrench and a flathead screwdriver. "Your fancy screens and flashing LED lights are a distraction," Frank said, his voice echoing from behind the blindfold as he stood back up, tools in hand. "A machine like this, it tries to hide its secrets in the dark. If you want to find out where it hurts, you have to level the playing field." He cracked his neck, adjusting his grip on the wrench. "Start a stopwatch, Mr. Harper. I've got a transmission shop to save." The sheer audacity of the gesture sucked the remaining oxygen right out of Hangar 4. For a moment, nobody moved. The dozen elite software developers and propulsion engineers simply stared, mouths slightly ajar, as the old mechanic stood before the $140 million XM70 juggernaut, with a greasy crimson shop rag knotted securely over his eyes. Mitchell Harper's face transitioned from an angry flush to a pale, terrified white. He looked at Colonel James Garrett, expecting the military liaison to immediately order the MP guards to arrest the crazy old man. But Garrett simply stood perfectly still, his posture rigid, watching Frank Sullivan with an expression of intense, calculated fascination. "Colonel, you cannot possibly be entertaining this," Harper hissed, stepping closer to the officer so his voice wouldn't carry. "He is blindfolded. He is going to blindly stick a wrench into a classified hybrid turbine bay. If he shorts the main capacitor bank, he'll blow himself up and take half the prototype's wiring harness with him. We need to stop him." Garrett did not blink. He slowly raised his hand, silencing the corporate director. "Quiet, Mitchell. Private Jenkins," the colonel barked, not taking his eyes off Frank. "Get a stopwatch running. Call out the time." "Yes, sir." Toby Jenkins swallowed hard, fumbling his smartphone out of his pocket and opening the clock application. His thumb hovered over the start button. Frank ignored the hushed, panicked whispering behind him. The darkness behind the red rag was comforting. It stripped away the blinding glare of the halogen floodlights. It erased the distraction of the frantic, blinking LED error codes on the diagnostic terminals. It wiped the arrogant, panicked faces of the MIT graduates from his mind. Without his sight, Frank's universe shrank to the pure, honest realities of heavy mechanics, smell, temperature, texture, and spatial memory. "Start the clock, son," Frank rumbled, his voice low but carrying effortlessly through the cavernous hangar. "Go," Toby said, pressing the button. "1 second." Frank stepped forward. He didn't hesitate or wave his hands in front of him like a blind man feeling for a wall. He knew exactly where the massive rear armor plating of the juggernaut began. He placed his calloused right hand against the cold, sloped steel. He moved sideways, his steel-toed boots sliding smoothly over the concrete until his hip bumped the heavy iron toe hook. From there, his spatial map was locked. 5 seconds. He reached up, grabbing the recessed climbing rungs built into the chassis. Despite his bad knee and the creeping arthritis in his spine, Frank hauled himself up the side of the 50-ton beast with the practiced, fluid grace of a man who had spent 3 decades climbing over armored vehicles in the dark under enemy fire. He swung his leg over the tread skirt and crouched beside the open, cavernous maw of the engine bay. 10 seconds. The heat hitting his face was intense. The turbine block was still radiating a baking, 200-degree ambient heat from the dozens of failed ignition attempts. Frank leaned his head over the bay. He could smell the acrid tang of burnt ozone from the overworked electric starter coils, the heavy, sweet scent of hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, metallic odor of stressed titanium. He plunged his hands into the dark, incredibly complex labyrinth of pipes, wiring looms, and moving parts. Down on the floor, Dr. Ian Hayes let out a strangled gasp. "He's reaching right past the high-voltage manifold. There are bare terminals down there that carry 4,000 amps. "Shut up, Hayes," Garrett snapped. 20 seconds. Frank's left hand, the one missing 2 fingers, slid expertly past a cluster of scalding pneumatic lines. He didn't flinch as the hot metal kissed his bare knuckles. His skin was too thick, his nerves too deadened from years of burning himself on diesel blocks in the Iraqi desert. He felt his way down the left side of the main turbine housing, his thumb tracing the smooth, cylindrical shape of the auxiliary hydraulic pump. There it is, Frank thought. Directly beneath the pump, hidden entirely from the overhead lights and completely obscured from the internal diagnostic cameras, was the secondary air intake baffle. It was a mechanical fail-safe, a physical valve designed to restrict airflow if the primary digital governor crashed. Frank's fingers ghosted over the titanium housing. He felt the cold, hard curve of a thick carbon steel tension spring. It was utterly wrong. Frank could feel the tension without even moving it. The coil was compressed so tightly it felt like a solid cylinder of iron. Some factory worker, likely exhausted and rushing to meet a corporate quota, had driven the retaining nut down with an impact wrench, bottoming out the thread and locking the spring under maximum compression. Whenever the engine tried to start, the massive vacuum of the turbine attempted to pull the baffle open. But the over-tightened spring fought back, violently snapping the valve shut. The sudden catastrophic drop in air pressure confused the tank's highly advanced computers. The software assumed the drive shaft had jammed and instantly threw the emergency brakes to prevent the engine from tearing itself apart. The computer was trying to save the tank from a phantom threat, entirely blind to the mechanical chokehold choking its lungs. 30 seconds. Frank transferred the flathead screwdriver to his crippled left hand. He wedged the heavy steel tip directly beneath the locking collar of the spring. The angle was atrocious. There were barely 3 inches of clearance between the baffle housing and the hot exhaust manifold. A normal mechanic, relying on their eyes, would have given up, demanding the entire engine block be pulled out with a crane to reach the part. Frank didn't need to see. He wedged the flathead in deep, finding the tiny groove of the retaining clip purely by the microscopic vibrations traveling up the handle of the screwdriver. 35 seconds, Toby called out, his voice shaking. Frank gripped the long-handled wrench in his right hand. He slid the open jaws over the square handle of the screwdriver, creating a makeshift, high-leverage pry bar. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the smell of diesel and ozone. and threw his entire upper body weight into his right arm. The pain in his shoulder was immediate and blinding. His rotator cuff, torn years ago and never properly healed, screamed in protest as he forced the tool backward. He gritted his teeth, a low grunt escaping his lips. 40 seconds. The stubborn steel fought him. The retaining clip was wedged tight, refusing to yield. Frank shifted his boots against the armor plating, finding a better brace. He thought about the foreclosure notices sitting on his desk. He thought about the bank manager's smug face. He thought about the pride of a machine that deserved better than to die in a hangar because of a careless factory error. He gave one final, brutal heave. Snap! A sharp, violent, metallic crack echoed through the silent hangar, as loud as a pistol shot. Down on the floor, Mitchell Harper flinched violently, covering his face. "He broke it! I knew it! He snapped the manifold!" Up on the tank, Frank let out a long, slow breath. Beneath his fingers, the tightly wound carbon steel spring violently decompressed, expanding by a full 2 inches as the retaining collar broke free. The governor valve instantly sprang open, returning to its proper resting position. The mechanical bind was gone. Frank carefully pulled his tools out of the engine bay, wiped his sweating forehead with the back of his greasy wrist, and slowly reached back to untie the knot of his blindfold. He pulled the red rag away, squinting slightly as the harsh halogen lights assaulted his eyes. He grabbed the climbing rungs and lowered himself back down to the concrete floor, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy, final thud. He tossed his tools back into the canvas bag with a clatter. 44 seconds, Toby whispered, staring at his phone in absolute awe. Frank looked across the space at the horrified project director. "Your baffle spring was bottomed out," Frank said casually, rubbing his aching shoulder. "It's breathing fine now." Harper was hyperventilating. He stormed forward, pointing a trembling finger at Frank and his chest. "You just snapped a component inside a classified military engine. I heard it break. You did not fix anything. You arrogant, washed-up old fool. You just voided a massive warranty." Frank did not raise his voice. He did not even blink. He just looked at Harper with the cold, deadpan stare of a man who was entirely out of patience for men in expensive suits. "Dr. Hayes," Frank said, his voice cutting through the hysterical rant. "Get in the commander seat." Hayes looked at Harper, then at Colonel Garrett. The colonel gave a firm, single nod. Hayes scrambled up the side of the juggernaut, his hands visibly shaking as he dropped into the hatch and pulled the ruggedized diagnostic tablet into his lap. "Initiate the ignition sequence," Frank ordered. Harper grabbed his hair. "No. If there is loose metal in that housing, the turbine will shred its own fan blades. It will be a catastrophic detonation. We are going to die." "Do it, Ian," Garrett commanded, his voice echoing like thunder in the enclosed space. Hayes swallowed hard, his thumb hovering over the digital ignition switch. He closed his eyes, muttered a quick prayer, and pressed the screen. The hangar lights dimmed slightly as the massive battery banks dumped raw power into the electric starter motors. The familiar, high-pitched whine began to build, echoing off the corrugated steel walls. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. This was the exact moment the engine had violently seized every single time for the past 3 days. Harper braced himself for the horrifying screech of grinding metal. Toby held his breath. Garrett crossed his arms, his jaw tight. Frank just stood there, leaning slightly on his good leg, waiting for the beast. 4 seconds. There was no screech. There was no violent shudder. Instead, the electric whine was suddenly consumed by a deep, guttural, earth-shaking roar. A massive plume of heat shimmered from the dual exhaust vents at the rear of the tank. The concrete floor of the hangar began to vibrate violently, rattling the toolboxes and shaking the laptops on the rolling desks. The giant juggernaut roared to life, its massive classified hybrid turbine spinning up flawlessly, roaring with the fury of 50,000 trapped horses. The sound was deafening, a beautiful, terrifying symphony of perfectly synchronized combustion and electrical torque. "Holy Mother of God," Toby whispered, staring at the beast. Up in the hatch, Dr. Ian Hayes was staring at his tablet as if it had suddenly turned to gold. He tapped furiously at the screen, pulling up the telemetry data, the fuel mixtures, and the drivetrain resistance charts. "Green!" Hayes screamed over the roar of the engine. Hanging halfway out of the hatch, his face split into a massive, disbelieving grin. "Everything is green. The rotational sensors are reading 0 resistance. Torque transfer is at 100%. The vacuum drop is completely gone. It is idling perfectly." The dozen corporate engineers in the room erupted into a spontaneous, chaotic cheer. Several of them hugged each other. Others collapsed into their rolling chairs, burying their faces in their hands in sheer relief. The billion-dollar contract was saved. The juggernaut was alive. Mitchell Harper stood frozen in the center of the room. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He stared at the roaring tank, then slowly turned his head to look at the grease-stained veteran standing quietly beside his canvas bag. His deep arrogance, his corporate pride, and his utter disdain for the old mechanic had entirely evaporated, replaced by a profound, crushing sense of humiliation. Frank did not gloat. He did not smile or demand an apology. He simply walked past the stunned project director, moving toward the heavy steel rolling workbench. He picked up the thick, leather-bound money clip, pulled the stack of crisp $100 bills from beneath it, and efficiently counted the cash. 50 bills, $5,000. He folded the money, slid it into the front pocket of his denim overalls, and patted it once to make sure it was perfectly secure. Colonel James Garrett stepped into the path as he turned to leave. The tall, imposing military officer looked down at the old mechanic. The sheer volume of the idling tank made conversation difficult, so Garrett stepped close. "I have spent the last 3 days watching a dozen men with doctorate degrees chase ghosts in a machine they built but did not understand," Garrett said, his voice raised over the noise, projecting absolute respect. "You found the ghost in under a minute, without your eyes." "A machine is just a machine, Colonel," Frank replied, his expression flat. "It does not matter if it has a microchip or a carburetor. If you do not listen to it, it will not talk to you." Garrett extended his hand. "My office needs civilian contractors, men who fix armor in the mud. Say the word, Sullivan, and you have a desk here by Monday." Frank shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, truly, but I have a shop full of broken trucks waiting for me and a bank manager to speak with." He grabbed his canvas tool bag. "Come on, Toby," Frank said. "You drove me out here. Now drive me back home." That is how true mastery works. No flashy screens, just pure, raw instinct. If you want to find out exactly how Frank bypassed a massive computer system and fixed the beast in under 40 seconds using nothing but touch and sound, hit that like button, share this story with anyone who appreciates real genius, and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below if you have ever fixed something the experts could not. More epic stories are dropping next.